Warning. The following may contain concepts, ideas, and or reflections unique in nature and not yet approved by government and or corporate entities. This content is for entertainment purposes only and is not intended to stimulate further reflection or to perpetuate additional discourse beyond the scope already outlined by institutional curriculum.
Your Grace, word from the Dominion of Canada. Costs are increasing there, and rent is unaffordable.
Is it?
Yes, my lord. What shall be done?
The problem with Canada is it's full of Canadians. We need to rout them out. Primo mense reditus. First month's rent, double it. If they can't afford it, we'll find someone who can.
But my lord, this could lead to a revolt.
Who is this man who speaks to me as though I needed his counsel?
I'm sorry, Your Grace. Consider it done.
Yes. Yes, I think I shall. If you have a physical body and reside on planet Earth, then you've likely come across the existence tax. Before you get started into your rigorous manual or mental labor and become taxed on your productivity, it is first important to understand the hierarchy of which you have been born to. Existence tax may occupy two main forms. The first is a real estate purchase. This is reserved for individuals intent on a long format existence, and a larger initial investment is required. Be warned, competition is more fierce here, and the costs are high, almost unattainably so, since the majority of the population lean towards clasping tightly to their mortal coil without letting go until the last possible moment. The second is renting, and profits those who are uncertain as to the longevity of their existence. This tax may be paid by the month up to the point of the renter's death. Some renters prefer this method since they can die whenever they like, and their next of kin will not be on the hook for any back taxes. Additionally, renting does not hamper their usefulness to their employer, as they may be easily shipped to and fro wherever their skills are needed most. If you are unfamiliar with the existence tax, then you are likely young enough that someone else is either paying your tax for you until you come of age, or they have already procured you a piece of real estate to legitimize your existence and help secure you a seat at the table of the living. The homeless are also not subjected to the tax, but I believe that this is more of a case of circumstance than a premeditated strategy on their part. In other instances, the government may step in and aid those who are unable to pay their tax. But to say that this process is dehumanizing would be an insult to other dehumanizing programs that yield better results. Prisons also waive the lodging fee for the low cost of an occasional shivving and or bathroom brawl. These conditions are quite affordable. However, my father said there's no such thing as a free lunch, and we're seeing prisons heading more and more in the direction of forced manual labor in an effort to break even on all that free rehabilitation they've doled out over the years. Some may think I'm just a whiny bitch who's looking for a rent reduction. First off, not a whiny bitch. And second, I own a home, but I did rent for 12 years prior and can speak to how broken the system is. On a side note, I left Western Canada for Quebec because it was one of the last affordable markets in Canada. Of course, this was before the pandemic, and now I think it's safe to say that there is no affordable market in Canada, either to buy or to rent. I also understand that the extreme inflation in real estate is not just a Canadian problem, and the same conditions may apply in other nations around the world. Still, Canada's problem is acute, and it is one that I'm most familiar with. That being said, let's get into the numbers. Rentals.ca posted the national Canadian average for rent at $1,976 for October of 2022. For a year, that would be $23,712. And the median Canadian income is around $39,500. So it wouldn't be crazy to assume that on average a Canadian could be paying roughly 59% of their income on rent. This is unsustainable. So how do Canadians get by? By living with their parents or piling in as many roommates as the support beams can handle? However, we've been doing this for years, if not decades now, and costs keep going up. But don't worry, the government is here to help. If you've never heard of medical assistance in dying or Bill C-14, I'll give you a hint. The acronym is MAID, as in someone who can clean up all of the debris and crumpled bodies clogging the drains of our lovely society. They seem to be more than eager to classify an inability to pay one's rent as a valid reason for chronic depression, since rents are never going to get any cheaper, and a person can apply for a lethal injection free of charge. Of course, the individual actually has to request this service, so it's not like the government is running around gathering everyone who can't afford to pay their rent and expunging the land of the living of the recalcitrant payers. How gracious of them. There is no shortage of politicians talking about housing affordability, and they all have a solution. A flaccid, ineffectual solution. An indecorous soul could call this nothing more than lip service. But surely they wouldn't want to reduce the voters into nothing more than neo-feudal serfs. There are 6 major banks in Canada. Previously it was 5, but National Bank has made some inroads in the market. Not that it matters much, since for the most part they are all mutually invested in one another, to the point that it is more effective to regard them as a singular entity for simplicity's sake. If you're curious, just search them up on Yahoo Finance and look up their major stakeholders. Why bring up the banks? Well, because we need to see just how valuable the Canadian real estate market is to them. According to statcan.gc.ca, there are 1,542,645 outstanding residential mortgages for the second quarter of 2022, and the average home price is around $644,000. If we conservatively say that the average mortgage has been reduced to half of the national average home price, to say $322,000, we have a total mortgage value of around $500 billion Canadian. Not a small sum, for this only represents the individual residential mortgages. And this does not include rental companies who take out loans to either buy or build apartment blocks, with commercial and industrial properties also being excluded. Also keep in mind that our GDP is around 2.68 trillion Canadian for 2021. Truly comprehending the scope of the Canadian housing market is nearly impossible, since the revenue from private rental companies is a mystery, and more equity firms are investing in housing blocks, and their data is confidential. But let's make an educated guess. There are 10.28 million residences in Canada, and let's assume that whether you're paying for a mortgage or paying for rent, your monthly costs are close to the national average for rent of $1,976. That would put the Canadian housing market at $20.3 billion a month, or $243.6 billion a year. This is the tax on your existence, a sum nearly equal to the total annual income tax collected, with the vast majority never seeing this money again. The average home price has increased tenfold in the past 40 years, from around $60,000 in 1982. I'll let you decide who profited the most. Also keep in mind that property taxes are calculated as a percentage of the estimated home value, so your local municipality is likely not crying over a tenfold increase in their revenue. An example of the benefits of the private-public partnership at its finest. No matter how one looks at it, there is clearly a large layout of cash in exchange for a roof over one's head. But is it really fair to compare overpriced real estate to feudalism? Okay, well, let's take a look at what we know about European feudalism. This will be a generalization, as feudalism in Europe did span many centuries across even more nations. The term might is right was never more true than in medieval Europe, and this was clearly displayed in the hierarchy of the society, with warriors seated at the very top and only sharing this position with the clergy as Roman Catholicism grew. If you owned land in Europe at this time, then you either were a warrior or were descended from one. If new lands were conquered or old lands were defended, and you displayed valor on the battlefield, your king would likely reward your efforts with new or additional lands and titles. Being a landowner meant being a lord, and vice versa. In exchange for your land, you would pay the king's taxes and jump into action whenever a new war sprung up. However, we all know that the world is not made up exclusively of soldiers, so who is taking care of the day-to-day? Enter the serfs, peasants, and freeholders. Now there is a hierarchy here as well, since they make up the largest proportion of the population. But let's not get bogged down in the details and simply say that these people owned no lands. They're the renter class, and in most cases they would do the farming, and the lord would take a certain proportion of the crop as payment, the percentage of which would likely vary from lord to lord. In the best case scenario, The freeholder was his own boss, working his own hours to make the land productive for both himself and his lord. But in the worst case scenario, the serf was in arrears on his rent payment and just working to try and break even. In conclusion, a fiefdom was a dark time in human history when the serfs would labor just to survive and pay their rent, and struggle at that. One major distinction between the feudalism of yore and the neo-feudalism of today is that labor had much more value in the past. First, the population was a small fraction of what it is now, and there was limited technology back then. If a lord continued to abuse his serfs, then they would start to buckle under the heavy yoke and eventually break. Or they could just abandon their lord altogether and seek out more equitable terms under another lord. Remember, only the king could grant land and title, so an abusive lord may not lose his land, but if he lacks decent labor, he will hold much less wealth than his more magnanimous counterparts. Furthermore, less quality labor means less tax being sent to the king, and it wouldn't be a stretch to say that a cruel, unreasonable lord would quickly fall out of favor in the court. Today, there are no feudal boundaries, and as global systems fall more in line with one another, there is less distinction between governments. Labor is cheap, and if you don't like your conditions, you will be replaced without a second thought. With our existence tax looming monthly, how much leverage do we have at the employment negotiation table when they know we have to come up with 60% of our gross pay to cover the rent? I have worked at jobs where they don't expect any of their laborers to last more than a few months, at places where the employers don't want you to lose a limb because of a potential workplace claim. Personally, I garden for pleasure, but I couldn't see mining for coal, tarring roofs, or working on an assembly line for fun. This is where many would lecture on the value of an education to avoid such base activity. But we are a ladder and a wood chipper, and being on a higher rung doesn't mean that you will be saved, it just means that you'll be next. We are a boiling frog. If 40 years of lost labor standards and a housing market explosion had happened overnight, we'd be in revolt today. But stretch it out over the decades and we slowly adapt.
I guess I can't afford a house in the city, turns to, I suppose I'll have to buy a condo in the suburbs, to, I'll need to rent until I find something more in my budget, to, how the hell am I going to pay my rent?
Until you're working 2 jobs you hate, in a moldy apartment, with the heat just high enough so the pipes don't freeze, eating a can of off-brand beans for dinner, wondering how you actually got here. And you don't dare go outside because not everyone took to abject poverty with the same level of dignity that you did. And the streets are clogged with drug addicts and thieves, all eager to be picked up by the militarized police to be stuffed into the overflowing prison systems for a warm cot and a free juice box. If this future seems to be hyperbolic, then let me ask you, if the only cost for increasing a $25 billion real estate market to a $250 billion one was a few grumbles and a handful of defaults, why not continue? They are in the business of making money, are they not? Or do the anonymous global investment firms have some altruistic secret master plan? Or maybe they have a special affection for the Canadian proletariat. Using slave labor to build up the richest playground of Dubai? Good. Using Chinese slave labor to build every trinket used on planet Earth? Good. Soaking up the African natural resource wellspring without a drop to spare for the local population? Good. Squeezing the Canadian population for the maximum amount of rent that they can conceivably afford? Whoa, whoa, whoa. We're not monsters here.